Well, my name is Dan. Those guys that are regulars here visit often realize that sometimes I get to speak. I'm not the lead guy here. Pastor Chris is away today, so I get to talk today, which is good. So I'm excited about that. I get to share with you guys today in the sermon series here about conversations with Jesus, as you guys see up there. So I do want to welcome you guys, even though, again, I'm not the main pastor here. Hopefully you feel welcome today, and if there's anything I can do for you, let me know, and we can talk maybe after the service. Let me take a minute to pray, and then we're going to jump in to John 21 here in just a couple minutes. But let's take a minute and pray as we approach God's Word. God, I thank you for another morning that we can meet here together. We thank you for the month of July. We thank you for, as a country, our Independence Day, the holiday, all the privileges that you blessed us with associated with that. But I thank you as well for just the day off for most of us and time with family, time with friends. And I pray your blessing on these people this week. We do thank you as well for this morning. We thank you for the opportunity we have to gather as citizens of heaven and talk about your kingdom and what that looks like and your calling and how you work. And I pray that something that is said today would be helpful and beneficial to everyone here, wherever they're at in their walk with you, or if there's someone here today that doesn't know Jesus yet, I pray that they would be overwhelmed by his love for Peter that we'll see today. Again, we commit the time to you. I pray for your help in it. In Jesus' name, amen. Right, well, in a couple minutes, we're going to be in John chapter 21. It'll be up here in just a couple of minutes. We'll get to that, but that's where we'll be today. And again, we've been doing a series for, 8 weeks or something like that. I have to go back and count, that we're calling Conversations with Jesus, where we're looking at different times that Jesus had sort of an extended conversation with one or more people. And that's kind of cool to do that. You kind of get, you feel like you get to eavesdrop maybe a little bit or listen in and see how Jesus interacted with the woman at the well or the woman that was caught in adultery or whatever it might be. Conversation we're going to look at today is a conversation between Jesus and Peter, and this is an awkward conversation. Now, I think all of us are familiar with awkward conversations, and maybe you are much more of an extrovert than me, and maybe to you there is no awkward conversation. Like we could give you any just like wildly inappropriate topic, and you would just jump up and just share with everybody about that. That's really not me. And I have to kind of think through how I approach some of these things, and I hate it when my kids catch me off guard with some question that's got an answer that I really don't want to give them right then. And some of you have been there. We've all been there, at least at some level. Unless, again, you're one of those unique people that just has no qualms about anything. And if that's you, great, use that gift for Jesus somehow. But this is going to be an awkward conversation, because the conversation we're going to look at is a conversation that Jesus has with Peter after Peter royally messed up. We don't have time to look at this today, but Peter, of course, on the night that Jesus is betrayed, Peter denies Jesus publicly 3 times. And again, we know the end of the story. We're like, yeah, he gets restored. But for just a minute, even before we get to John 21, I want us to think about what it would feel like to have been Peter. I mean, you were the rock, literally, right? Jesus picked you as Peter and said, you're the rock, and I'm going to build the church on you. Peter's one of the inner 3. Peter's one of the closest 3 guys to Jesus. Peter's a guy that walks on water, at least for a little bit, and then he sinks. But that's another story for another day too. But Peter walks on water. Peter is right there with Jesus. Peter is the guy on the night that Jesus is going to get betrayed. Peter's like, if everybody leaves you, Jesus, I'm going to die for you. And Jesus says, nope, not yet at least. But he says, nope, before the rooster crows, before dawn, you're going to deny me 3 times. And Peter's like, I'd never do that. Then again, today, we don't have time to look at that story, but if you're not familiar with it, you could flip back, or if I get too boring, you can just scroll back on your phone and look at that. But Peter actually denies Jesus 3 times in one night, and it's pretty rough. He doesn't just sort of say, yeah, I don't really know that guy Jesus. No, the Bible says he actually curses about Jesus. And obviously that's to save his skin, and we get the story, but again, feel the weight of that if you're Peter. It doesn't say it in John's gospel, but it says over in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it says that after Peter denies Jesus and the dawn breaks, Peter goes out and weeps bitterly. And again, I think we need to feel that a little bit. So when Jesus is dying on the cross, on the hill, John is there and Mary is there, and Peter ran off to weep bitterly. Like Peter can't even bring himself to the point that he goes to see the cross. Okay, fast forward 3 days later, Jesus rises. That's awesome. John tells us in his gospel about the fact that the disciples hear that some of these ladies have gone and the tomb is empty, and Peter is one of the guys that runs and sees the empty tomb. So Peter's seen that. So Peter apparently is still at least somewhat associated with the other guys. He's seen the empty tomb, and then Peter's, I'm sure, putting all this together. Now, again, it's easy for us to sit back and say, yeah, Peter, yeah, everything's good now and it's awesome. But can you imagine being Peter and thinking in your head, what am I going to say to the risen Christ and Lord of the universe the next time I see him? What's he going to say to me? Is he going to chew me out? Is he going to yell at me? You know, like how's this going to go? I mean, this is an awkward conversation that's coming. And this is what we're going to see here in John 21 in just a minute. We're going to see Jesus is going to meet with some of the disciples in John 21, but specifically after Jesus talks to a few of the disciples, he's going to call Peter aside and he's going to talk specifically to Peter. And this is going to be tough. As we're going to see here in a minute when we read this, it's going to say that it grieves Peter that this conversation has to happen. But what's awesome here, and the key idea, the main takeaway that I want us to take away today, the conversation with Jesus, between Jesus and Peter, is that when we fail, and notice I said when, not if. When we fail, Jesus restores us and calls us to join him again in his mission. So when we fail, Jesus restores us and calls us to join him again in his mission. And that's really awesome. The gospel is not just an entrance into Christianity. The grace of God is not just a one-time deal. By faith, we accept Jesus, and we're sort of in his group. But then, man, if we mess up, we're fired, we're out, we're kicked to the curb. No, the gospel keeps working, and that's awesome. Now, again, this isn't, okay, so go mess up for Jesus because he'll keep forgiving. No, Paul writes about that. That's another sermon for another day. But the fact of the matter is, we as servants of Jesus, even if we don't have the exact same calling as Peter, we all mess up at times. If you're like me, it doesn't take very long to think of some times that I've messed up. Think about things like parenting. If you're the perfect parent, I would love to talk to you and take lots of notes. I mess up at that a lot. Things like relationships. We mess up at that. We do selfish things. We say stupid things, right? We do stupid things. We mess up. Things like those relationships, things like interpersonal relationships, things like the spiritual disciplines. You ever start one of those read the Bible through a year plans, and by like January the 4th, you've bailed? Or if you're awesome enough to make it through like Genesis, you hit Leviticus and you're just out and it's over? And now, side note, not the point of the message, there are some plans that kind of mix that up a little bit, not to slam Leviticus, but if that's something you're interested in, talk to me and I can maybe help you find that. But if you're like me, sometimes we feel really bad about that, to where we feel like almost like Peter the night Jesus is betrayed. You know, we're like, Jesus, I'm going to stand with you. I'm going to pray every day. I'm going to read my Bible. I'm going to do it this month. Like, I'm going to get it done this month. And then like day 3, we blow it. And we feel like that. We feel like we've messed up. And I'm afraid that sometimes we as Christians that have been saved and changed by Jesus live with guilt and shame that we don't need to bear. Now, guilt and shame is a theme that Chris talks about a lot. I don't want to steal his thunder or anything like that. But guilt and shame is taken away at the cross. And that's not just a forever thing. That's an every single time you fail thing. Jesus died to take away guilt and shame forever. But Jesus died to take away guilt and shame over your parenting mistake yesterday. Jesus died to take away guilt and shame over the fact that you committed to read your Bible last month and didn't, or whatever it might be for you. Again, we're going to see this fleshed out in Peter, which again is really, really awesome. So one more time, key idea, and then we'll walk through this passage for a few minutes, apply it, and then transition into communion. One more time, key idea is that when we fail, Jesus restores us and calls us again to join in his mission. And we're going to see that this happens here in John 21. Now, it's interesting. If you were to take a minute and go back to John 20, which we're not going to read, it like feels like the book ends there. So if you were to take a minute and go back to John 21, you sort of get this whole like, John says, the reason I wrote this book to you is so that everybody would believe in Jesus as the Son of God and have life. And all of a sudden, then we come to John 21, and to me, it almost feels like if you go see a superhero movie and they start rolling the credits, nobody leaves the theater, right? Because you're going to get the teaser for like the next Avengers movie, or you're going to see some crossover where, oh no, the DC characters are going to be in the other movie. And it's kind of like everybody sits there even though the credits are rolling, and that's sort of what we feel like here. John it feels like he ends his book in chapter 20. The reason I wrote this is so you'd believe in such. And then all of a sudden we have this kind of weird tacked on chapter where Jesus is going to talk to the disciples one more time, but I think John puts this in so that we sort of get closure to the Peter story, and again, I think we see ourselves there. So even though it sort of feels like the book ends at the end of 20, let's pick up here in 21, verse 1. It says, later, Jesus appeared again to the disciples beside the Sea of Galilee. This is how it happened. So this is in the time period Jesus has risen. He's not ascended to heaven yet. And Jesus has appeared to the disciples a few different times, but this time he's going to appear beside the Sea of Galilee. Now, I don't have a handy-dandy gigantic map or illustration. And back when people all used to bring hard copies of Bibles, which we don't anymore, and no guilt trip there, you always could say, like, flip to the maps in the back, right? Anybody have a Bible like that? No. Anyway, well, if I had that, I could say, flip to the maps in the back, okay? And the Sea of Galilee it's a small lake, basically. It's not that big, and it's up in the north. But this is significant because this is really close to where Jesus is from, and this is really close to where at least a few of the disciples are from. We don't know where all of them are from, but Peter, Andrew, James, and John are from this area. On top of that, this is the spot, or at least this lake, somewhere around the lake, is the spot where Jesus called these guys the first time. So I think that's going to matter here in a minute, okay? So they're up by the Sea of Galilee, and this is how it happened. Verse 2, several of the disciples were there. Simon Peter, Thomas, nicknamed the twin, Nathanael from Cana in Galilee, the sons of Zebedee, and 2 other disciples. So we got a group of these guys. Verse 3, Simon Peter said, I'm going fishing. Now, for a lot of us guys or ladies, perhaps, that go fishing, for most of us, unless you're a commercial fisherman, and I don't know that, for a lot of us, this is a hobby, but we have to remember for Peter, this was a job, probably a family business. And before we read it in between the lines here too much, which I don't want to over-examine this, but to me, I think what we're going to see here, both by what Peter does and how Jesus interacts with him, is I think this is sort of Peter essentially saying, guys, I have blown it. Like, I was supposed to be the rock, and I wasn't. I was supposed to die for Jesus, and I didn't. I publicly denied him. I'm out. I'm going fishing. I'm going back to that. And maybe, God bless you guys. You guys go serve Jesus, but I am so broken. I'm so mangled. I'm so filled with guilt and shame. I'm out. I'm going back to the thing that I know. I'm going fishing. So these guys are going to go with him, at least a few of them. Here's what they say. They say, we'll come too, they all said. So they went out in the boat, but they caught nothing all night. Any of you guys or ladies ever fish and do that? Catch nothing? Yeah, I've been there a lot of times. Nothing more aggravating than catching nothing and catching nothing and catching nothing, but you just keep thinking the next cast or whatever's going to get it, but it just doesn't happen, okay? So they fish, it says they fish all night and they catch nothing. Verse 4, at dawn, Jesus was standing on the beach, but the disciples couldn't see who he was. So you get the idea, maybe, the sun's just coming up, or it's still a little dark and such. The disciples couldn't see who he was. He called out, fellows, have you caught any fish? Now, a minute ago, I said there's nothing more aggravating than fishing and not catching anything. Let me tweak that a little bit. There's nothing more aggravating than fishing, not catching anything, and then having another person walk up and be like, did you catch anything? And you want to hit him with your fishing pole, right? It's like, no, I didn't, but anyway, awesome. So Jesus calls out and he says, fellows, have you caught any fish? No, they replied. And again, I think this is going to be tough for them because this is what they do. They're not just like me, the weekend warrior that tries fishing. I mean, this is their business, right? So Peter here has been fishing all night, and I kind of envision Peter, James, John, whoever's in this boat, getting really aggravated about this and trying all the little coves and nooks and crannies in the lake, trying to find fish. They're not finding fish, and it's unsuccessful. And I think this is going to be part of the object lesson for Peter. I think Jesus here, we're going to read the conversation in a minute, but I think Jesus wants Peter to see, hey, this is not what I want you doing with your life, Peter. Now, I don't think Jesus is necessarily standing on shore, using the force or whatever, directing fish away from the net. But I think Jesus, who's Lord of all, can make sure no fish get caught in the net all night. And I think Jesus is doing that. So here's what happens then. Let's read on. So I got to keep moving. Got to get to the specific conversation with Peter. Verse 6, then he said, throw your net on the right-hand side of the boat, and you'll catch some. So they did, and they couldn't haul in the net because there were so many fish in it. Now, I tend to think maybe they're starting to figure out this is Jesus, perhaps. The next verse, for sure, they do. Because to me, that would seem like a really dumb, sarcastic thing for somebody to say. Like, you're a pro at this, like, you fish, that's what you do. You've tried this all night, and one side of the boat or the other, frankly, is not going to matter a whole lot from a human perspective. But this guy calling out from the shore says, throw on the other side of the boat. They did, and they caught a bunch of fish. It says so many that they're having trouble reeling it in or bringing the net in. Fast fishing story on this real quick, and I promise not to tell too many fishing stories. And I promise all these are true, right? Every fishing story is always true, right? One time I was fishing with my 2 kids, Peter and Andrew, my 2 kids, who happen to be named Peter and Andrew. Isn't that kind of cool? They fish. And anyway, you can think through that. We were at Oak Grove Lake Park, which that's off Battlefield Boulevard behind Lowe's and Home Depot, and if you don't know where that is, fine, but some of you may know where that is. We're back there fishing, and that's really a park people take their dogs, is basically why people go to this park. But you can actually fish. It's a big drain for parking lots, so I probably wouldn't recommend eating anything you catch, but that's up to you. We're trying to fish there with my kids, and it's really accessible, so we're fishing there, and we're fishing on one of these docks, and my kids are small, so, we have a fishing pole, but they're basically just kind of cane fishing, just, hanging it in there. We're not getting anything. So anyway, my son Andrew looks at me, he's like, Dad, we need to try the other side of the dock. And now you guys know where this is going because we're in this story, but I'm like, Andrew, why do we have to try the other side of the dock? It's got a cricket or whatever on your line, it doesn't matter. And so Andrew literally takes his little fishing rod, plunks it over on the other side, and in a second or two, he's like, Dad, I got something. And of course, as a dad, I'm thinking, my kid just hung up his hook on the bottom of the dock, and I'm gonna have to get this thing out. And he pulls up a smallmouth bass, just right on the other side of the dock. And I'm like, that's awesome. So we have the smallmouth bass, which we're going to throw him back. And he's like, it's just like the Bible. We just had to fish on the other side. And I'm like, okay, now I put it together, And, and of course, in my mind, I'm thinking the next time we go fishing, hopefully my kids don't turn atheist when, we try the other side of the dock and we don't get anything. And, it's not like a name it and claim it fishing promise. So be careful there. But anyway, fast fishing story from my kids. Back to this, though, because I got to keep moving to get to the conversation with Peter. So they catch a bunch, okay? Now, again, why do I think Jesus does this? I don't think this is just Jesus messing with them, being evil and sadistic. I think Jesus wants all of them, and specifically Peter, to see when you try it your way and not the way I want you to do it, it doesn't work. So, Peter, I don't want you fishing, Peter. I want you to be the rock on which we build the church. So, Peter, if you're going to listen to me, it's going to work. If you're not going to listen to me, you're going to have an empty net, I think is what Jesus wants them to get. Okay, verse 7, let's keep moving. Verse 7, it says, Then the disciple Jesus loved, that's John's way of referring to himself. So this is John. Then the disciple Jesus loved said to Peter, It is the Lord. When Simon Peter heard it was the Lord, he put on his tunic, for he had stripped for work, and they would kind of strip down to sort of shorts-like things to work in, okay? But he's going to grab his tunic, he jumped into the water and headed to shore. So Peter here is actually going to go to Jesus, and I think Peter is understanding that this confrontation is inevitable, and Peter wants to go talk to Jesus. Now, I don't want to sort of speak from what's not in the Bible, but to our knowledge, Peter and Jesus have not had a one-on-one conversation. So again, I feel like this is going to be the awkward conversation with Jesus coming up. So Peter goes, Peter jumps out, and Peter heads to shore. Verse 8, the others stayed with the boat and pulled the loaded net to shore, for they were only about 100 yards from shore. When they got there, they found breakfast waiting for them, fish cooking over a charcoal fire, and some bread. Now, again, I don't want to overanalyze and find symbolism where it's not, but it's interesting here, really specifically the words that John uses for this fire, this charcoal fire, is the exact way John describes the fire around which Peter denied Jesus. And so, again, I don't want to overanalyze here, but I think that's significant. Jesus is here by a fire. And I think this is Peter starting to have flashbacks maybe, right? That I was by a fire in Jesus, and I think all this is coming together in Peter's mind. Verse 10, here's what Jesus says. Jesus says, bring some of the fish you've just caught, Jesus said. So Simon Peter went aboard and dragged the net to shore. There were 153 large fish, and the net hadn't torn. So they counted them. Probably they were going to sell them or whatever, okay? So they bring some. Verse 12, now come and have some breakfast, Jesus said. None of the disciples dared to ask him, who are you? They knew it was the Lord. Then Jesus served them the bread and the fish. Where have we seen that before? Jesus likes to serve bread and fish, reminding them he's the provider. 5 loaves, 2 fishes, we get that, right? Verse 14, this is the third time Jesus appeared to the disciples since he had been raised from the dead. Here then is the conversation with Peter, and again, we want to keep the key idea in mind. Jesus now is going to zero in on Peter, and he's going to restore Peter and call Peter again to be a part of the mission. Verse 15, after breakfast, Jesus asked Simon Peter, Simon, son of John, do you love me more than these? Yes, Lord, Peter replied, you know I love you. Then feed my lambs, Jesus told him. Verse 16, Jesus repeated the question, Simon, son of John, do you love me? Yes, Lord, Peter said, you know I love you. Then take care of my sheep, Jesus said. A third time he asked him, Simon, son of John, do you love me? And Peter was hurt that Jesus asked the question a third time. He said, Lord, you know everything. You know that I love you. Jesus said, feed my sheep. Now we're going to read on here in a minute, but finally now this awkward conversation comes all together. That Jesus now has Peter sort of one-on-one, or perhaps the other disciples are in earshot, but even then, Peter and Jesus are going to have this conversation, and it's going to come down to Peter being restored by Jesus, having his calling renewed by Jesus, and restoration happen. Now, here's how I think this happens, because if you're sitting there thinking, but I don't see a lot of flowery language about restoration, here's how I think this happens. I think it's significant, first off, that Jesus uses Peter's full name. Now, I don't know how many of you have kids in the home right now and how many of you call out their full name, but I think this is something that transcends culture, right? When your full name is used, you're at the DMV, or it's, you're getting yelled at, or like there's only a few times like your full name gets used. One of the other times, though, that Jesus uses Peter's full name, if you're to go all the way back to John 1, is when Peter is called the first time by Jesus. When Peter is actually called, Simon, son of John, come follow me. So Jesus is sort of revisiting this call. And I think we're going to see that again as we walk through it. What's more than that, Jesus is going to ask Peter 3 times this question. Now, when other people have talked on this passage, and I don't have a lot of time left to go through all this today, a lot is made of like the different Greek word for love or the different word for sheep and lamb here. And to me, a lot of people have talked about that. To me, that's not the main point of the passage. And again, there's a lot of reasons for that. To me, I think the main point is Peter blew it 3 times. So what does Jesus give Peter the opportunity to do 3 times? Essentially proclaim that he does love him. So Jesus here is looking at Peter, uses his full name, gets his attention, and looks at him and says, do you love me? Now, the first time it's interesting, first time here in verse 15, he actually says, do you love me more than these? And people argue sometimes, what exactly does he mean by these? Is Jesus asking Peter, do you love me more than these other disciples love me? Or do you love me, Peter, more than you love these other disciples? Or it could be, Peter, do you love me more than these fish? Now, again, probably all of them are true. I kind of lean toward the fish one. I think what Jesus here is doing again is he's restoring Peter, but he's recommissioning Peter to be a part of the mission. And basically, I think what Jesus is saying to Peter is, Peter, you're supposed to be the rock. I want to build the church on you. My calling on your life is not fishing. Do you love me or do you love fish more? I think that's where Jesus is going. So he uses his full name, do you love me more than these? I think it's really, really cool, not only the question Jesus answered or asked him, but the reply. Because again, if you're Peter, if I'm Peter, I'm expecting Jesus to look at me and say, Simon Peter, why did you deny me? That hurt me. I was so embarrassed. You're a terrible person. How could you do like? That's what I would expect Jesus to say to me. That's not what Jesus says. Jesus says, Simon Peter, do you love me? I'm going to let you, Peter, speak for yourself. Is there still love in your heart for me? Because I think what's understood here is, Simon Peter, I love you. That's why I pursued you. That's why we're standing on this beach. That's why we're having this conversation. I loved you enough to pursue you. Do you still love me? Are you willing to be restored, and are you willing to get back on mission for me even when you failed? So Peter 3 times is going to reply that he loves him. But then what I think is cool is Peter's getting recommissioned, and he's getting recommissioned to Jesus' own mission. Because again, the reply here is not, don't deny me again. Even though I suppose that would be good advice, right? It's not, Simon Peter, do you love me? Yeah, I love you. Well, never deny me again. Don't ever do that to me again. No, he says, feed my sheep. Now, cool providential twist. The last time I got to talk a couple weeks ago, I got to talk here about Jesus being the good shepherd. And maybe you were here that day, maybe you weren't. But I think that's actually a really cool thing here. Because you've got Jesus, who's the good shepherd, now telling Peter, feed my sheep. Or again, if I can put all that together, my mission if I'm Jesus, my mission is to be the good shepherd. And Peter, now I need you to be a shepherd too. I need you on team shepherd, if I can put it that way. Like, I need you on my team. I need you doing my work. I need you shepherding my sheep. I need you tending my lambs. That's what I need you doing, Peter. So 3 times he asks, again, I think that corresponds to the 3 denials. Again, the core here is love, right? Do you love me? Because it's obvious I love you. And then he's commissioning Peter to do his own work. So Jesus is going to go on there. So he's restoring Peter, he's recommissioning him. Verse 18 says, Peter again, or Jesus speaking to Peter, says, I tell you the truth, when you were young, you were able to do as you liked. You dressed yourself and went wherever you wanted to go. But when you are old, you will stretch out your hands, and others will dress you and take you where you don't want to go. Jesus said this to let him know by what kind of death he would glorify God. Then Jesus told him, follow me. Now, really quick, this passage is kind of weird to us. Like, okay, that's kind of weird. Like, okay, so a kid does, gets dressed by their parents in goofy clothes for picture day, or whatever, and doesn't like that and has to, go sit on a bench in Penny's while their mom shops or, whatever it is. Like, kids do that. And why is Jesus telling Peter this, or what does it really mean? And I think what we're going to see here, John even gives us this editorial comment that this is a description of how Peter's going to die. And in fact, in Greek, they had a euphemism for crucifixion because in polite company, you didn't discuss the cross. It was seen as too vulgar. So they would say, stretch out your hands was a nice way of saying somebody was going to be crucified because they'd literally lay the guy down on the ground on the board, stretch out his hands and nail him down, right? So I think John gives us the editorial comment here that Jesus now is telling Peter, you're back on my team, you're restored, I need you doing my work. But Peter, this is not going to end well, at least from a physical human standpoint. But I think it's cool the way John phrases this. He doesn't just say Jesus was telling Peter the way he was going to suffer and die. It says he's telling Peter by what death he would glorify God. And don't skip over that verse. Now, this is the part of the message that doesn't preach well, okay? Sometimes we glorify God by feeding sheep and following him and eating fish on a beach, and sometimes we glorify God by having our hands stretched out and nailed to a cross. And I think this is what Jesus is telling Peter. This is not going to end well. But then he says, follow me. And I think, again, that's a cool order of things that he does, because Jesus now has restored Peter. He's recommissioned him. And again, he's going to repeat that call, that follow me, same phrase he used 3-ish years earlier on that same beach by that same lake while they were fishing. We're repeating all that. But now Jesus has laid it out in no uncertain terms. Peter, I love you. Do you love me? Yeah, I do. Peter, I need you to feed my sheep. But you're going to die for it. You going to follow me? And Peter does, which is pretty cool. That love for Jesus, that restoration that Jesus gives is going to stick with him, and he's going to make it. Now, interestingly enough, we don't have time to develop all this. Peter's really quick going to be like, well, what about John? Like, does he have to die too? and again, Peter's still human, right? And of course, Jesus gives him the answer, that doesn't really matter to you, don't worry about it. But it's interesting that most people, myself included, believe that when John wrote this, Peter had already died. That when John is actually writing this down is probably sometime 80s to 90s, something like that. Peter probably dies mid-60s under Nero. Again, these are probabilities, but the point being, when John is writing this down, I think John is reflecting on the fact that Peter died for it. So what we have here then is we have this powerful story between Jesus and Peter, where Jesus here identifies Peter who failed. And frankly, Peter who failed probably in the worst possible way that we can imagine. And again, we all fail, but can you imagine being Peter, like I talked about earlier? Identified by Jesus as the rock, walked with Jesus, saw Jesus cast out demons, saw Jesus do all the miracles, promised Jesus he wouldn't deny him, publicly denied him 3 times. That's a failure. But Jesus here restores him and calls him again to join in the mission, which again is really, really cool. Now again, for you and for me, our failure may not be the same as Peter, but we will fail. And our calling may not be identical to Peter's. You may not be called to shepherd a church, for instance, exactly like Peter was, but I think the principle or the takeaway is the same. Because again, we'll all fail. We all fail in our walk with Jesus. But again, the good news of the gospel, the good news of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection for you and for me is that it takes away guilt and shame when we do fail. And Jesus, if I can put it this way, says to us, after we've fallen, do you love me? And that calls for some soul searching. That calls for some quiet time with the Lord where we reflect and we say, yes, I do. And Jesus says, hey, get back on mission. So 3 ways to apply that, and then we're going to transition into communion, and I'm done today. So 3 ways to apply this today. Right, first off, think about how your walk with Jesus is going right now. Think about that for a minute. Do you feel like you failed Jesus? Do you feel like you failed him recently? And I'm not going to, interrogate you or anything like that, but just take a minute and think about that. Do you feel like you failed him? And again, if you're like me, it doesn't take very long to start thinking of ways. Again, like some of the ones I mentioned earlier, parenting, relationships, spiritual disciplines, whatever that may be. But do you feel like you failed him? Do you feel like you've got that guilt and shame in your heart and in your life from failing? If you feel that way, how have you responded? Maybe take some time to think about that. Have you sort of gone the Peter route where you think harder, work harder to fix problems? Have you gone maybe the avoidance route? Have you gone to destructive behaviors or other things like that instead of coming to Jesus who loves you and wants to restore and recommission you? So here'd be the way, number one, to make this practical. Take some time today by yourself. I just find it works better for me by myself. I don't know if you do it better in a large, loud crowd of people, great. But take some time maybe by yourself to get away and really pray about those failures. Maybe pray, and as you do that, read over John 21 again. But take some time today to pray about those failures, commit those to Jesus, and specifically ask him to take away guilt and shame. So application number one, reflect on your failures, take some time to get away, commit those to Jesus, and specifically ask him to take away guilt and shame because he loves you. He loves you enough to die for you. He loves you enough to pursue you and restore you and recommission you, just as he did with Peter. So first off, reflect on failures, commit them to Jesus, ask him to take away guilt and shame. 2 more and I'm done. Application number 2. Take some time today or this week to be encouraged by what I'm calling the next chapter of Peter's life. And I don't have time to talk about it today, but if you want to write it down or just remember it, or you can Google it later, your phone's smart enough to find it, right? The next chapter in Peter's life, even though John doesn't write it here, we'd find it in the book of Acts. In the next chapter in Peter's life, we find Peter in Jerusalem approximately 7 weeks after the death of Jesus. That's not very long. Preaching Jesus publicly in front of the exact group that crucified Jesus. And that's really awesome. And in fact, in Acts 4:12, and I promise not to give a mini sermon out, I got to keep it moving. In Acts 4:12, Peter is in front of the exact same Sanhedrin that ordered Jesus crucified. And Peter looks at them and says, there's salvation in no other name other than the name of Jesus. So Peter gets another shot. So this week, take some time to be encouraged by the next chapter of Peter's life. Take some time to read Acts 2 through 4. If you want to write that down, you can Google it or find it later. Take some time to be encouraged by that. Maybe as you read, make some observations about the way that Jesus empowered Peter post-failure to serve well. And be encouraged by that. Again, even if your calling is not the same as Peter, even if God's not calling you to get up with a tongue of fire above your head and preach to 2,000 people, if he does, awesome. But for most of us, that's not our exact calling. But be assured, whatever your failure may be, Jesus restores, recommissions, and can empower you to serve there well again. And that's really awesome. So take some time this week to be encouraged by the next chapter of Peter's life. Okay, last one and I'm done then. Application number 3, and I'm going to close. Take some time this week to be encouraged by the last chapter of Peter's life. So application number 2 is the next chapter, Acts 2 through 4. Application number 3, take some time this week to be encouraged by the last chapter of Peter's life. Now, if you're like, Dan, that last chapter is awful because he got crucified. Okay, I get that, all right? You don't necessarily need to dwell on the fact that Peter got crucified, but dwell on the fact that Peter finished well. Peter made it. Now, finishing well for Peter, the death by which, as John said, he glorified God was an awful, grisly one, but Peter finished well, and a passage I'd suggest maybe you reflect on, you could read all of 1st and 2nd Peter would be great, but 1 Peter 5, the first couple verses there in 1 Peter 5, and I won't take time to read it, I'm just going to look at what the verses are, but if you were to take time to look at 1 Peter 5, 1 through 4, Peter writes both of these letters toward the end of his life, and in 1 Peter 5, 1 through 4, it's really cool to me that Peter is writing to other leaders, and in the last chapter of Peter's life, he uses the shepherding analogy, which I think is really awesome. I think it's stuck. I think John 21 stuck with Peter. I think if he got a tattoo in his arm, it would have been "Feed my sheep," and that was like his north point on the compass for the rest of his life. Or if he would have had a little frame picture in his house, I think that's what it would have been. It stuck with him. He got it. Jesus said, Peter, I restore you, feed my sheep. And in 1 Peter 5, at the end of Peter's life, or toward the end of his life, I want you to be encouraged that he made it, even to the point that that's his advice for other guys. Shepherd well, because when the great shepherd appears, that's going to be an awesome day. That's what Peter says. So application number 3, again, take some time this week to be encouraged by the last chapter of Peter's life. Read 1 Peter 5, 1 through 4, and maybe again make some notes about the way that Jesus not only restored Peter and recommissioned him, but empowered him for the next chapter and the last chapter, and again, be encouraged by that. Right, I'm going to go ahead and pray. We're going to transition into our time of communion today, but let me pause and pray as we do that, okay?